Today is the birthday of one of the most profound revolutionaries in history, Mahatma Gandhi. With so much conflict plaguing the world, with constant crackdowns on dissent dominating the news, Gandhi's call for change through non-violence is perhaps more important and relevant today than during India's independence movement. That's why I'm extremely honored to have had the opportunity to speak with the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, Arun Gandhi, an activist and author of the book Legacy of Love, My Education in the Path of Nonviolence. I first asked him what lessons from his grandfather have stuck with him the most.
Well, I think the most important lesson was about understanding nonviolence. I find today most people, when they talk about nonviolence, they are only concerned about absence of physical violence. What my grandfather taught me was that we commit a lot of non-physical violence, which he described as passive violence, in the form of oppression, suppression, economic, political, social, cultural, religious exploitation, and all of these things where we don't use any physical force, and yet we oppress and hurt people. And that passive violence is the fuel that fires physical violence. So logically, if we want to put out the fire of physical violence, we have to cut off the fuel supply. And since the fuel supply comes from each one of us, we have to become the change that we wish to see in the world. And that, I think, is a very important thing for all of us to understand, because it's not just the physical violence that we should be concerned about, but all the other non-physical violence also.
Absolutely, that structural violence that's bred in the system that we live in, Arun. Your grandfather once declared support to the British war effort, even proposed an armed volunteer unit as a young man. What was that catalyst in his life to pursue that path of nonviolence?
Well, he started it in South Africa when he personally suffered prejudice because of the color of his skin, and he was thrown off the train, and that was the moment of change in his life. He reflected on that episode and he wanted justice, and he realized that fighting for justice is not going to get anything at all, and so he discovered peaceful ways of getting justice, and that became the catalyst for a change. And over the years, it kept evolving and growing and becoming clearer to him. And, you know, if you look at his initial thing, like you mentioned, in World War I, he supported the British effort, and he was also recruiting people for the war. And yet it went against his philosophy of nonviolence. But after that, he realized that, it's not just the physical violence, but we need to be concerned about the non-physical violence also, the structural and the other passive violence that we experience.
And your grandfather's tactics of satyagraha, of nonviolence, resulted in revolution, one of the few that we can point to of successful change through nonviolent means. Why do you think it's been so difficult for others to mimic that today?
I think it is difficult because they don't really understand nonviolence. They think as long as they are not showing any, or not, physically beating up anybody, they are nonviolent. But there is a tremendous amount of hate and anger even in a nonviolent struggle. And if you have that hate and anger in you, you cannot really practice nonviolence sufficiently. So, in Gandhi, in all of his struggles, he always stopped people from referring to anybody as enemies. When he was fighting for India's independence, he said, the British are not our enemies. They are our friends, and we have to change their thinking. And so it was, always free of hate, free of anger. And that is how, when we eventually parted with the British, we parted as friends. So one has to understand nonviolence thoroughly before you can practice it effectively.
Beautiful. And of course, Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 merely for being elected. Your grandfather never won, even after his death. I mean, what message do you think that sends about the difficulty of achieving recognition for true activism?
Well, I think his Nobel Prize comes from the fact that so many people after him have taken his philosophy and made a difference in the world. And I think that speaks louder than getting a prize and some money. So I don't regret that he didn't get it, and I'm sure he wouldn't regret it either, because he never did anything for a prize or for recognition. He just did because he believed that it was the right thing to do.
Absolutely. Your grandfather also supported the state of Israel, spoke out against the persecution of Jews, of course, after World War II. But he said the only way they could coexist in Palestine is if they, quote, convert the Arab heart. Where did this go wrong, and what do you think needs to be done to bring peace to this tumultuous region today?
I think in all of the, we've created this whole culture of violence, and everybody from politicians, religious leaders, business leaders, everybody, our whole concept of leadership is top-down leadership. The top leaders are the herdsmen, and the people must act like sheep, and they must be herded wherever the leaders want them. And that's not how we must function in modern times. People must have a say in what is, and not, I don't mean say in the sense of going and voting once in 4 years or 5 years, but they should be actively involved in their destiny. And, this whole concept of culture of violence, where we control people through fear and make them do what they have to do, I think that is a very wrong thing.
And speaking of kind of that cult of personality, let's shift to India today, where the new Prime Minister Narendra Modi is being celebrated across the media. He's invoked your grandfather's name several times to bolster his policies. How do you think his vision of India differs from your grandfather's?
Well, I think the basic difference between the two visions is that grandfather believed in a secular India, where he believed that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and everybody who exists in India have a right to being in India as much as anybody else. But what Narendra Modi and his party are trying to do is to make India a Hindu state, because Hindus are in a majority, and they want to make the other smaller minority religions into second-class citizens, or even push them out of the country, as they are trying to do with the Muslims. They're trying to push them out into Pakistan and making it very difficult for them to live in India. Now, while he was here just last week in his own state, where he was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people in a few years ago, again last week they had communal riots in the city of Baroda, but that was suppressed. The news was suppressed because they didn't want to embarrass him. And this kind of thing still goes on, and his own party is responsible for it. And although, he got off when the Supreme Court cleared his name there, he does still have that moral responsibility, because he was the head of that state at the time. And if he could not control his police and his officials and stop this kind of a rampage that took place there, then he's not an effective leader.
Exactly. And we have about 30 seconds left, but what is your advice to activists today, given the militarized crackdowns we're seeing against dissent across the world?
Well, this whole thing about suppressing people through fear, using military force or using police force and that kind of thing to suppress people it's outdated. People have to, now they are awake. They want, now, just as in Hong Kong, the young people are fed up with the system and they want a difference.
Thank you so much for your incredible insight, Arun Gandhi, grandson Mahatma Gandhi. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.